Hey everybody, we're going to do an activity today to follow up on our lesson from last class where we learned about regulated and unregulated natural monopolies. So let's go ahead and take a look. You should have these same slides in your Google slide or your Google Classroom, so you can open those up and we're going to be going along with this together. So the first thing we're going to do is we are going to look at a natural monopoly that is unregulated, and we're going to properly label and find important areas on the graph. So we're going to label our graph first. Remember what I always say, a happy graph is a labeled graph, so mind your P's and Q's. We're going to show the quantity and price that the monopolist is charging when unregulated. We're going to show the area of consumer surplus, the deadweight loss, and the areas of profit and loss. And we're also going to find the areas of total revenue and total cost, but we're not going to calculate those just yet. We're going to learn how to find them first. All right, so here is our unregulated natural monopoly. Now, this box over here contains items that you can click on and move around, and we're going to be putting those onto the graph to show the specific areas that we're looking at. And down here in the notes section, I have put a couple hotkeys and shortcuts that you can use to make working on Google Slides easier. Okay, so the first thing we want to do, label. So we need to label our axes first. That's where we're going to start. Move the camera up. We know that price is our independent variable and quantity is our dependent, because price changes and that affects quantity because the amount that we buy depends on how much it costs. Think about what gas prices currently. When gas is really high in price, you can't fill your entire tank up. So your quantity demanded is going to decrease. And if the price goes down, you're going to fill your tank all the way up. So your quantity demanded increases. So price is our first label that we're going to use. And remember, in economics, we have reversed axes. Independent variable is on the y-axis. Dependent is on the x. That is where quantity is going to go. Now that we've labeled our axes, we need to label our lines on here. So first, note you have your two downward sloping curves here. That's always a good starting point because you can remember the monopoly swag. You've got demand on top and marginal revenue on bottom. Marginal revenue is longer than the demand. You'll often see marginal revenue going straight through the x-axis because the point where marginal revenue equals 0 is also significant. It's going to tell us where our maximum total revenue is. So this is our monopoly swag here. So let's go ahead and label these curves. The upper curve is demand, and the bottom one is marginal revenue. You can just put that next to it down there. So remember, marginal revenue slopes downward because if you increase the quantity of goods that you sell, you must decrease the price. All right, so next let's look at our green and our red curve here. The green curve is downward sloping and then it continues on. If we could see like an extended, like super IMAX sized picture of this graph, you would actually see that that does eventually slope back upward into a U shape, and that's how we know it's our average total cost curve. So your average total cost is how much it costs to produce a good on average based on the number of goods that you're producing. So it's important. Average total cost is going to be found where the quantity is set when we're looking at a particular producer's quantity. That leaves the last curve here to be our marginal cost. And in this instance, we are assuming that the cost of producing the next unit is the same each time, and that is why it is horizontal. So now to find the price, if this were a perfectly competitive firm, they would be producing where demand equals supply. That would be the socially optimal quantity of production. But this is an unregulated monopoly. And remember what I told you about monopolies, they will always underproduce and overcharge. So they're going to produce less goods to limit the amount that are on the market, and that drives up prices. Think of like diamonds. There's way more diamonds out there than are actually for sale, and that helps keep the prices high. So instead, our producer is going to be determining the quantity that they produce where their marginal revenue is equal to their marginal cost. So perfectly competitive firms, they would set the quantity and therefore the price where demand equals supply. Monopolies, they're going to set their quantity at the point where the last unit they make is equal to how much they earn from selling that unit. So the marginal cost of producing that good is equal to the marginal revenue. If it costs me $1 to produce that last cup of lemonade, then I'm also earning $1 from selling it. So they're going to stop when they have squeezed every last drop of marginal revenue out of that sale. And that is going to be where they set their quantity, not their price. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to hold shift down to make this line go straight. I'll drag it all the way down to the quantity line there. And I'm going to grab my quantity label. Let's go ahead and stick that on there. So this isn't where they set their price though. They're going to charge people what they're willing to pay. So remember that video that we watched on monopolies with the CEO of Luxottica, the eyeglass company, and he said with his Emperor Palpatine voice that everything is worth what people are willing to pay. They're going to charge you based on your willingness to pay, your demand. So if we take that quantity line and we just go straight up to where that hits demand, that is going to be where the price is set on the y-axis. Now, I tell you guys to draw the line up a little bit higher. This is your line of significance. Remember why we call it that. Anytime another line on this graph crosses this quantity line here, the line of significance, that's an important piece of information. Where it crosses demand, average total cost, and marginal revenue, all of those are going to be important bits of information. And everything to the right of that line is not irrelevant. We're going to label that and understand what it is too, but there's no transactions happening beyond that point. The number of goods produced stops right on that line. So these are your significant areas. This is not an important area for what we're doing, so we can just ignore that. All right, so now we need to see where our price is at. So again, we're going to charge people what they're willing to pay, and that is where the quantity is equal to the demand. So if we just pull this line out over here to where it touches our y-axis, that's going to give us the price for this good. Now remember, had this been a perfectly competitive firm, they would have priced where supply equaled demand, which would have been a price way down here, much lower than what this particular monopoly is charging. And that's because it's the only one who makes the good. So if you want to have it, you got to pay their price for it. All right. The next thing I want to look at is how much it's costing my producer to make this good. One of the major problems that I see students have when they're finding the area of total cost on a graph is that they pick the wrong place to base that off of. They want to choose like a place that's right here or down here or over here, but none of those are on your line of significance. They're not going to, this is not where you'll find the average cost of producing this quantity of goods, because we're not producing this quantity of goods. We're producing this quantity of goods right here. So that is going to tell us what the average cost of producing each good is. And if we multiply the average cost by the quantity, that will tell us what the total cost is. So I'm going to take this line and I'm going to set it right here where the average total cost curve crosses our line of significance. And I'm going to pull it all the way over to the price line. And that is our cost of production. Now, normally you don't have to label this on an AP graph, but they ain't going to count you off if you do that. Overdoing things, over labeling is never going to lose you points unless you label the wrong, you put it in the wrong place. But if it wasn't required, they're not going to grade on that. So I always add my extra labels just so I know where everything's at, because there's a lot of lines on here. It gets confusing. So now we're going to find our total revenue. So remember that total revenue is the price times the cost. Price times the quantity, not the cost. Price times the quantity that you sell. So if I sell 10 goods at $1 each, that is a $10 total revenue. It's not my profit, it's my revenue. Revenue is what you bring in, and then profit is what you get to keep. So we'll set our total revenue box right up here where the price is, and I'm going to pull the corner all the way down here to the quantity. So the price times the quantity, the area of this rectangle right here. That's your total revenue. Next thing we need to find is our total cost. So what is it costing this producer to make all of these goods, the total amount of goods? We know what the average cost is of the quantity that's produced, and that's right here at C. The total cost, like the total revenue, is going to be, in this case, the cost times the quantity. So I'm going to put my total cost box right here and drag that down. So notice that there is a part of the total revenue box that is not covered up in red. The red area is what they do not get to keep. It's what it costs them to make the good. And the leftover blue area, that is revenue that they do get to keep. And that is our profit. So we're going to drop our profit box on here. And there is our area of profit for this firm. Now it's green for money. But we aren't done yet. We still have to find two other areas that are significant. So we have our consumer surplus here, consumer surplus triangle. Now remember, your consumer surplus is the difference between what you were willing to pay for something versus what you actually paid for it. So on a really, really hot day and you're super duper thirsty, you might be willing to pay $5 for a bottle of water, but instead you only had to pay $1, at probably $2 now, inflation. That difference between the 5 you were willing to pay and the $2 that you did pay, the $3, is your consumer surplus. It's what you saved in an economic sense. So consumer surplus is found below the demand curve, above the price line, and alongside the y-axis. So what is the highest amount somebody was willing to pay for this good? To learn that, you have to follow the demand curve all the way up until, in this case, where it's tangent with the y-axis. So this would be the highest price that somebody was willing to pay for this good. But they didn't have to pay that price. They paid at P1. So from the top of the demand curve down to the price and over, that's going to be our area of consumer surplus. So this is the willingness of all the consumers who are willing to pay more for this good but didn't have to. Everyone below this line didn't make a transaction because they weren't willing to pay the price for it. So again, no transactions happen beyond the line of significance. So let's stick our consumer surplus triangle up here. And a lot of kids, I'll see them do this and they'll put it down there below the marginal revenue. That's not to do with the consumer in this case. We're looking at their demand. So make sure it stretches out all the way underneath that demand curve. And then the last, and I'll show you how to calculate this too. It's the area of that triangle, but we're not doing it today. And the last thing we have is our dead weight loss. So your dead weight loss is the monetary value of all the transactions that people wanted to make in this market but did not get the chance to because the goods weren't produced. So there were consumers who wanted to buy goods all the way down here to where supply meets demand. But those goods don't exist. The quantity is not all the way over here past the marginal revenue curve. It is over here at Q1. So none of these transactions happened. So no money was spent, no money was made. So that is loss to society. We call that the deadweight loss. And it stretches all the way to the point where supply meets demand or demand crosses the marginal cost curve. And that is it for the unregulated natural monopoly. Next time, we will look at a regulated natural monopoly and see how that differs. Have a good day.